May 23rd, 2016 was the very first day I ever played Overwatch. Before this, not only had I never played a Blizzard game, I had barely even heard of Overwatch in the first place. I only really encountered it from a friend who recommended that I try out the beta, and since he talked about it so enthusiastically, I decided to give it a go. So instead of continuing my first playthrough of Uncharted 4, that day after school, I downloaded the Overwatch open beta on my PlayStation 4. PS4s did a lovely little thing where they hard throttled your download speed, so by the time it was finally ready to play, the beta only had about an hour left before it would go offline to prepare for launch. And I mean no exaggeration when I say this. That hour changed my life. I only remember getting about 4 matches in during my time with it, but it only took that amount to get me to instantly whip out my debit card and drop $60 on a game I barely knew anything about. The feeling that less than an hour of Overwatch gave me back then is something I don't think I'll ever experience again. I wanted to start this video with a personal anecdote because I think it's important to point out that everyone will have a different experience and will not necessarily feel the same as I do. I'm going to talk about some observations I've made about the Overwatch scene and the gaming landscape in general. So even though I'll talk about the community at large, I know there are lots of complicated and varied feelings that may not apply to everybody. Also, I will be talking about Overwatch Classic a lot, and I want to make it clear that I think it's a great limited time game mode, and I've had a decent amount of fun with it. My quarrels are not with Overwatch Classic itself, it just helps me make my argument. Keeping all that in mind, let's talk about nostalgia and its relation to Overwatch. This video was inspired by the release of the first Overwatch Classic event and much of the reaction surrounding it. See, Classic is supposed to be that hit of nostalgia that transports you back to a simpler time, but unfortunately, I don't think that is really the case. We aren't watching a new movie where they make a sick reference to the original, or God forbid, parade a dead person around like a puppet and pretend it's a celebration. These types of callbacks are supposed to remind you of the thing that you're nostalgic for, but Overwatch Classic is a different beast. It's not a reference or an homage to the thing that we miss. We are, for the most part, playing the game like it was back then. Except, we aren't. We are playing Overwatch 1 with the knowledge and skill of the following 8.5 years. The illusion of 2016 Overwatch is shattered when you watch a Tracer 180 blink melee and then perfectly connect a pulse bomb on 3 people in your very first match. People did not know what they were doing back then. There need to be Lucio skating on the ground and looking at the sky, and Reinhardt standing still and holding shield like their very lives depend on it for it to feel a little more like it did back then. Because you have to remember, in 2016, the gaming landscape was very different. Believe it or not, there was a time where multiplayer games came out without much thought put into competition or super longevity. Before Epic Games and their infinite sum of Unreal Engine money completely shattered the reasonable expectations of what a multiplayer game could pump out in terms of content, the primary reason to stick with playing a game was not to continually get better at it. While there will always be people who want to take games seriously, the prospect of esports was not a priority to developers or players. The vast majority of players played these games because they found them to be fun and then maybe later stumbled into competition. I mean, hell, Overwatch didn't even launch with comp, and we don't really talk about Season 1 anyways. Of course, competition and fun are not mutually exclusive reasons to play something, but $40 to $60 games don't sell tens of millions of units being primarily competitive experiences. My point being is that there wasn't as much of a widespread idea that you had to get as good as possible at a multiplayer game to enjoy it. So the level of game understanding and mastery and the rate at which those factors accelerate is much lower than any game that would launch today. Overwatch was originally super chaotic, in some ways because the majority of the player base had no real incentive to get as good as possible at it. They wanted to pick the silly character they liked and kill some people, plain and simple. There was very little understanding from the general populace on how to actually play the game, and the people trying to do that were still figuring it out over time. There also was way less of a pressure to push yourself to get better. Being good at games did not hold the social clout that it does nowadays. All of these combined to make 2016 Overwatch feel very different than it does today. While we play this Overwatch Classic patch and wonder how anyone could ever enjoy this, there was a fundamentally different understanding of why people liked it back then. It straight up played differently even though it's exactly the same. It's also worth mentioning that people were finally experiencing the world, the writing, the art, the characters, all of that great extra Blizzard detail for the very first time. There are so many artistic levels and little details of Overwatch that pushed it above and beyond other games in the genre that I think overall we have taken for granted way too long. There was this mystique and intrigue during the launch window about the game and its world that hasn't really been replicated since in Overwatch or really in any other game I've seen. I know we all joke about Overwatch's Game of the Year win, and I think all 4 other nominees stand the test of time better, but the merit was there. It really was an industry-defining moment. The swan song of the pre-free-to-play generation of multiplayer games, even if we didn't know it at the time. There are so many more factors I could list forever that made Overwatch so popular and well-loved, and maybe I'll make a video about all of that later on in the future, but all of this to say, you can't capture the feeling of old Overwatch anymore. It is too tied to the time period that it launched in. If Overwatch launched in the gameplay state that it's in right now, with the old business model, I guarantee you that it would have the exact same impact as the game did back in the day. It still has the characters, the charm, the gameplay interactions, the art design, and on and on and on and on and on, and that's why Overwatch blew up in the first place. It was never the micro gameplay details that we care about now. Now, that's not to say that there weren't moments or aspects from the past that were better than they are now. Lord knows we've all been critical of Overwatch these past couple of years. But I think the atmosphere surrounding the most beloved times of Overwatch's life cycle that we hold dear hold much more weight on our relationship with them than the actual game state itself. I do want to be clear that obviously it's possible to have fun with these modes. I've had really fun moments with this one so far, don't get me wrong. But I've also had some extremely frustrating games that devolve into half the people in the lobby picking Widow and basically playing a different game from live and even from 2016 Overwatch. You can put 2016 into 2024, but you can't take the 2024 mentality out of the mix. And that's really what I want to get at here. So much of the recent Overwatch conversation revolves around bringing old stuff back or straight up reverting to older versions of the game. Hell, I can't even believe we are getting such extensive 6v6 tests. I was always convinced it would never happen. But the developments the player base have made between launch and the present are not going to go away. The way we play the game has shifted. There will never be a perfect time capsule of any moment in Overwatch's life cycle. So when you suggest a feature comes back or sweeping balance change reversions to go into effect, you have to think about how the player base will interact with that now. How they interacted with it then is not reflective of the whole picture anymore. I've spent a lot of time talking about the feeling of nostalgia and the feeling of Overwatch in the past, and I'm sure it sounded like I just want to invalidate anyone's feelings who has felt frustrated by Overwatch recently. I want to make it clear, your experience is valid. We all have our own relationship with the game and also our own reasons why we love it so much and keep playing it. But with that in mind, I want us to aim our vision at the forest and not necessarily get hung up on the trees. Try not to get bogged down by the specific details of whatever time you wish we could go back to, and instead focus on the feeling of that time. Think about the bigger picture. What things made that time feel so special? What was different back then compared to now? With the present in mind, how can we realistically get back to that feeling you hold dear? The gameplay landscape has changed. Player expectations have changed, so it's time for us to adapt our suggestions to the time. I think Overwatch Classic was a great idea for a limited time mode, but it has really served as a wake-up call to me. While nowadays I am very in touch with the minutia and nuance of competitive play and game design, back then I didn't care about any of that stuff. I was diving into the lore, speculating on new characters, and playing with my friends all the time. And I still do that. For me, the feeling that made Overwatch my favorite game of all time for 4 years never went away. And that's why I'm still here. And honestly, this YouTube channel has been my new way to reconnect with that creative and speculative side of early Overwatch that I always loved. I found a way to re-spark my connection to the game, and now every single Overwatch announcement makes me feel as excited as they used to in 2016. It's just taken a different shape. But for all of you who are still chasing that feeling, it may be time to reevaluate if capturing it is even possible. Just as the player base at large sees Overwatch differently, so does the dev team. While they are much more open to change and feedback nowadays, they still have their own ideas of how the game should be. Rightfully so, of course. It is their game, their art, and I don't think we are necessarily entitled to anything. I understand it's live service, and that's an extremely complicated topic that I've struggled to put into words in the past, but at the end of the day, they make the decisions. So keep that in mind when pitching changes, because there will be things that clash with their goals for the game that they won't do, and I don't want you to feel like you're being strung along. And of course, we've all had our different relationship with the game, and they can't really appeal to everybody. If your nostalgic feeling comes from double shield bastion comps on Volskaya, unfortunately, I don't think you'll be able to recreate that. I want to circle back around to my original anecdote because I didn't tell the whole story. May 24th, 2016 was actually right in the middle of my very last week of freshman year of high school, so those first couple months of Overwatch encompassed the entirety of my summer where I was still too young to have a job. All I did that summer was play Overwatch with my friends. That is it. It is literally the only thing I can remember. I had unlimited time, no responsibilities, and was only limited by the battery lives of my DualShock and my headset. Part of that original feeling Overwatch gave me was enabled by a lack of responsibilities. When school came back and I started getting busier, I had less and less time to devote to the game. After a year, I basically completely stopped outside of some rare moments. It wasn't until my first year of college where I was able to actually dive back in, since so much more free time opened up for me. And March 2020 opened up a lot more of it, which is when I really got back into it. But I knew that this time would be fleeting, so instead of letting it fade away, I used that time getting into the competitive scene and building relationships in the Overwatch community, so that feeling I got from Overwatch originally would always be around. And this Overwatch channel is an extension of this shift of my relationship with the game. Truth be told, I don't feel nostalgic for the early days of Overwatch because I've always been able to keep it fresh and interesting for myself. And to be honest with you, if I tried to chase why I loved early Overwatch so much, I think my adult life would only ever get in the way of what I felt back then. I know most of this video was about the past and being influenced by it, but we do live in the present. While we can't always wish we could return to simpler times or recapture them the best as we can, I think the easiest way to reconnect with the things we love is to engage with them as they exist now and what they can be in the future. Obviously, my path was personal to myself, but I do really believe there is a world where everyone can enjoy the game in the way that they want to, in some form. Whether that comes from personal expression or future changes, I hope that we can reconnect with what gives us the most joy, at least in some regard. This video came from the heart, and I really do not mean any ill will towards anyone who enjoys classic Overwatch or misses the days of GOATs or Overwatch 1. If you didn't like this video, I completely understand. But if you did, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe to see more. I have a lot of projects coming up and plenty more scripted videos, and I'm excited to share with you guys. Also, please, I'd love to hear about your experiences with Overwatch in the comments below, because I think everyone has a story to tell. I actually am working on a project related to just that, so stay tuned for that hopefully soon. Also, like the video while you're at it if you wouldn't mind, it does really help me out. If you want to get in on some of these discussions live, check me out at twitch.tv/LaytonHemingway. I stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and there's always something to talk to me about. And if you want to just talk all things Overwatch, join my Discord, the link is down below. Okay, once again, I'm gonna get out of your hair. Thank you for watching or listening, and please have a good day.